It's no secret that Flesh and Blood is on the more expensive side of TCGs, at least when it comes to fully tuned decks. However, not everyone is preparing for a pro tour, and so in this video, I want to go over some of the game's best budget generic cards so that you can tune up your deck for armories without breaking the bank. I'll be going over a multitude of cards that can slot into different decks, explaining their purpose and where they fit best, so that you can have an easier time figuring out what to play. Some of these cards will be competitive staples, while others are more niche picks to replace some of the more expensive options. Everything on this list will either be a common or a rare, meaning that none of these cards should ever cost more than a few bucks on the high end, with most of these being pennies on the dollar. I won't be putting the prices for cards up on screen, but just to highlight how cheap they are, the most expensive one, synced below, is only about $2.50 at the time of making this video. But with all that preamble out of the way, let's first take a look at the generic attacks. Go wide aggro is a very common strategy in Flesh and Blood, and it's facilitated by having plenty of attacks with go again and draw effects like Enlightened Strike. Classes such as ninjas, runeblades, rangers, and even guardians to an extent might want to lean into some of these cards to help spread their damage across multiple attacks. First up, we've got Scar for a Scar. It's a 0/4 that requires you to be at lower life than an opponent to have go again, but being at lower life is fairly easy to do since you can just block less on the turn that you have this in hand. This is a super easy card to slot into pretty much any deck that wants an extra attack on their turns. Then there's Ravenous Rabble, which attacks for 5 and has guaranteed go again, but it reveals the top of the deck and reduces its power by the pitch of the revealed card. Rabble is very strong in a heavy red deck since it will often be a 0/4, but it doesn't do well in a heavy blue deck where you'll often reduce the card to just 2 power. I'd say that if you've got over 21 or so blues in a deck, I would choose other options before playing Ravenous Rabble. Then we've got Snatch, a card that doesn't have go again, but is a staple in pretty much every go wide deck thanks to having a 4 power breakpoint and an on hit that draws a card. And while not having go again is a downside with things like agility, quicken, and embodiment of lightning tokens, as well as equipment like Snapdragon Scalers, there are plenty of ways to give this go again to abuse the draw effect. But even as a chain ender or a 1-card play in the late game, Snatch can either force blocks or it gives you an extra card to arsenal, setting you up for the next turn. On the opposite end of the power spectrum, we've got a card that's pretty much exclusively played by Guardians, but I still think is worth mentioning, Zealous Belting. This card is a 2/5 that gets go again if the card you pitched has higher power than itself. And considering Guardians have plenty of blue attacks at 6+ power, this is fairly easy to do. So if you're building a Guardian deck and you need a little extra oomph on your turns to deal with things like Illusionist, Zealous Belting is a great option. But moving on from the aggro slanted decks, we've got 2 cards that serve both an offensive and defensive function, Fiendal's Fighting Spirit and Battlefront Bastion, both of which are great for any mid-range or defensive deck that wants to grind out value. Fiendal's Fighting Spirit is a 3/7 and has the added bonus that when it attacks or blocks, it gains you a life if you're lower than your opponent. Only blocking for 2 is definitely a downside to this card, but the flexibility of gaining that point of life, whether you choose to attack or block with it, is what makes it so good. In Flesh and Blood, games can often be decided by just a single point of life, and so being able to attack for 7 or cover a breakpoint and gain 1 life when you're lower is super solid. It's also worth mentioning that both the red and yellow of this card serve as fantastic phantasm poppers because you'll gain that life on block before the attack is destroyed and the chain closes. As for Battlefront Bastion, well, it's honestly pretty similar to Fiendal's Fighting Spirit, except that the extra value on this card is only on defense. This beefy boy is not only a solid 3/7 to throw at your opponent's face, but it's also a fantastic block card thanks to its ability to prevent the next 1 damage you'd receive. This means that even though it blocks for 2, it really blocks 3 and it's split up. This card is amazing against aggro decks that have lots of 4 power attacks and is also a great tool to use against daggers from ninjas or assassins. Also, because this card gets its value on defense, you can comfortably run the reds and or blues in a deck as long as you don't have to worry about new in your local meta. Moving on from these though, we've then got one of the most important types of attacks, Disruption. Playing Flesh and Blood without Disruption in your deck is like bringing a knife to a nuclear bomb fight. Unless your deck is pure aggro or combo, you're probably gonna want to pack some ways to mess up the opponent. Command & Conquer is by far and away the most popular Disruption card, but there's also Weak as Slink, Censor, and Erase Face as other great examples. All of these interrupt the opponent by either forcing them to block or to take a detrimental on hit, and which ones you run changes depending on what decks you're trying to hinder. Of course, these budget cards are a bit more specific than simply destroy all cards in Arsenal, but they can still be incredibly impactful if brought into the right matchups. To start, we have Smash Up, a 1/5 that reveals a card in an opponent's arsenal on hit, then banishes an attack action. This effect is very strong due to pretty much every hero putting attacks in their arsenal on the regular. However, being 1 cost means that Smash Up doesn't fit into every deck. While the on-hit is strong, you don't want to just pitch a blue to play this, and so having something else to use up 2 resources like a weapon or other attacks is key. Then there's a card that I feel is just a little underrated, Cut Down to Size. This attack is a 2 for 6 that forces the opponent to discard a card if they still have 4 cards in hand when it hits. This might not seem powerful at first glance, but much like Command and Conquer disrupting the arsenal, if your opponent is trying to have a powerful turn with all of their cards, Cut Down to Size basically forces them to give up a card in hand. And versus aggro decks especially, having 1 less card in hand can often mean a lot less damage will be sent back at you. This card is fantastic against classes like ninjas, mechanologists, and rune blades because of this. Next, we have another 2 for 6, which is a little more specific, but is still quite strong, Humble. Its on-hit removes the opponent's hero ability, and while this won't be super impactful into every matchup, there are some that really don't want this to hit, like Leviah, Viserai, and KO, for example. Even though Humble isn't relevant against every deck, there will always be new heroes with new abilities, and this card might just be, well, what you need to deal with them. And to close out the 2 for 6 attacks, there's Hand Behind the Pen. Similar to Smash Up, this flips and banishes a card when it hits, except Hand Behind the Pen hits non-attack actions specifically. This is usually going to be a little less relevant than hitting attack actions, but can still be very powerful against classes like Rune Blades, Wizards, and Rangers, who will often try and save a powerful non-attack for a later turn. As for 3-cost disruption cards, we've got 2 in Tongue-Tied and Blanche. Tongue-Tied is the final piece of the trio from Rosetta, being the 3 for 7 Arsenal hate card alongside Smash Up and Hand Behind the Pen. It's got the same ability as those two, except that it banishes instants from Arsenal. If you're playing a deck that is fine sending a 2-card 7 and you're targeting illusionists or lightning heroes who have plenty of instants, then this card could be a solid pick. But finally, we have Blanche, another 3 for 7, which when it hits, removes all colors from opponent's cards for the next turn. This attack is definitely a bit more niche, but can be quite strong specifically into the Mystic heroes who care about blues, light heroes who care about yellows, and draconic heroes who care about reds. And Blanche is especially useful into any illusionist that cares about color, which so far has been all of them, because not only does it shut down an important part of their strategy, it's also a 7-power popper for their phantasm attacks. However, that is it for the budget attack portion of this video, but there's still some more cards to look at though, so let's hop over to the non-attack portion. While attack action cards are an incredibly important part of Flesh and Blood, there are a lot of non-attacking cards that help make up cohesive, powerful strategies. Cards like Premeditate, Warmonger's Diplomacy, and Hold the Line are great examples of powerful utility pieces that serve different purposes, some offensively and others defensively. Starting out on the offensive side, we've got the 2 attack reactions, Razor Reflex and Pummel. Red Razor Reflex is an attack reaction that works on attacks with 1 or less cost, as well as daggers and swords. It costs 1 and gives the targeted attack +3, and if it's an attack action that hits, it gets Go Again. Razor Reflex is really strong when paired with a card like Snatch, as it can both ensure the on-hit and give it Go Again, but it's also just generally playable in things like ninjas, assassins, and even warriors to some extent. But on the flip side of Razor Reflex, we've got Pummel, a card that can actually be played in pretty much any color, although the reds are usually favored. This attack reaction costs 2 and only buffs hammers and clubs, as well as attacks that cost 2 or more. But the real power behind this card is that when you buff an attack action, it then adds an on-hit effect that forces the opponent to discard a card. A very classic play in competitive Flesh and Blood is playing a Command and Conquer and a Pummel off of a blue and a Tunic trigger to destroy the arsenal and force a discard. And while you can't obviously do those things on a budget, you certainly can play Pummel on a card like Humble or Hand Behind the Pen, and you can even use something like Blossom of Spring to do it off a single blue as well. But moving on from attack reactions, we then have some of the game's best defense reactions with Sink Below and Fate Foreseen. What's there to say about these cards that hasn't already been said before? There's 0 for 4 defense reactions with beneficial abilities when you block with them. They stop breakpoints, cover attack reactions, and are just fantastic utility pieces all around. These two have been staples in competitive Flesh and Blood since their creation, and unless they get banned, I don't see that changing anytime soon. However, we've then got Unmovable, another defense reaction that is less ubiquitous than Sink or Fate, but is still quite strong. Unmovable costs 3 to play, but blocks for a whopping 7 on the red, or 8 if you play it from Arsenal. This definitely isn't something you want to run against low to the ground aggressive decks, but is instead a great option against go tall decks, especially if they pack Dominate like Bravo or Azalea. But if it's arcane you'd like to block, then you can look no further than Oasis Respite. This is a 1-cost instant that prevents the next 4 damage, and if you're lower life than the opponent, you gain 1. This card is fantastic against wizards as you can use it to stop a big chunk of arcane damage that you otherwise might not have been able to block, and the life gain is just icing on the cake. And speaking of life gain, the final card for this video is what won Pro Tour Los Angeles, Sigil of Solace. This 0-cost instant does one very simple thing. Gains you 3 life. And in a game like Flesh and Blood, where your life total determines how much agency you have in a game, gaining up to 9 can be incredibly impactful. If you and an opponent are on low life and you're both forcing blocks, being able to suddenly bump your life total from 1 to 4 can be game winning, as it gives you just enough breathing room to keep an extra card in hand to retake the tempo. If you're playing a more mid-range or defensive deck, then Sigil of Solace is a great include. But that is it for this video. As I said in the beginning, Flesh and Blood can be a pricey game to get fully into, but not everyone wants to or can spend the money on a playset of Command & Conquer. I remember back when I was a broke college student and I was getting really into TCGs, I just didn't have much money to spend at all, and I thought that like $10 for a card was absolutely absurd. So obviously I played on a budget, and while I didn't win as often as I wanted, I still got to enjoy fun games, and as time went on, I slowly grew my collection and evolved into the TCG fanatic I am today. And so hopefully this video helps some of you out there with building your first deck or making some changes to a tournament winning deck. Flesh and Blood is a truly amazing game, and I don't want to see people feel that they can't participate at all because they can't afford some of the more expensive cards. Sure, you're probably not going to take down your local armory with all budget cards, but you can still have a fighting chance. You can even start to win games as you improve as a player. So again, hopefully you found this all helpful, and if you want to see more Flesh and Blood content, consider subscribing. Thank you for watching, and an extra special thanks to the patrons. You guys are amazing, and I really appreciate all the support. Thanks to the GigaChad Saint, Geeks First, Elixir, Vinny, Smokeopotamus, John, Ty, James, Chemical, Bryant, Transient Fire, Dark Memoria, Big Hungry, and Wolf Shadowmancer. Then we've got the Alpha Chads, Thomas, Zajima, and Aaron. And finally, there's the Super Chads, Thal, Cece, Eric, Ben, and Yogbadiddles21. Thanks again as always. Stay Chadly, my friends.